I have a strategy when you land your very first job in tech, but to be honest, it's pretty much any job. The 4 things that you need to do within the first 6 months, right? And so obviously keeping it technical related, I'll tell you the 4 items and I'll expand upon it. It's code, process, team, value. Those are the 4 things you need to do in your first 6 months. So what does that mean? Code. You got to know the code base. There's no way around it. Now, nobody's saying that you need to memorize it line for line for line, but you need to know that code base. And so, and the reason why is in the beginning, when you're in team planning meetings, when you're sprint planning reviews, et cetera, when you're talking about ticket, you're in meetings for like refining tickets and backlog, you need to kind of understand what that code looks like. No, we just got back from Florida, and it's like I keep having these discussions. And so even when I was in Florida, we were talking about how we see the future of like coding going, right? And I feel like I'm having the same arguments or the same discussions. I don't want to say arguments, spirited debates, but I feel like I have one angle that a lot of people don't even like think about. And so the discussion that I had, Leon, was like, all right, people are even telling people now, like, you don't really need to learn like the programming language itself, right? Like you don't have to learn the programming. You don't have to learn the programming language itself. What you need to focus on instead is like learning basic English and how to, I guess, explain to the AI what the problem is. But the problem is, I know, dude, it's like I was literally having this discussion. I was like, the problem is even on a good day, like the code that it produces is pretty mediocre at best. Like it's not great code. And so when we're having this discussion, I'm like, but if you don't have the programming logic in mind to look at that code and then improve upon it, what are you even doing? Like, how do you get that?
It's like pure Twitter brain rot, right? Like it's just
like I can't even explain it because like to me this seems like such a bad idea that it should be painfully obvious it's bad. But people are like, no, you don't get it. Like you can make a whole startup now without even knowing how to code, just putting in AI prompts. I'm like, I'm not going to dispute that, right? But what I will just say is, if you don't know how to fix that code, who's stopping the average hacker from even applying SQL injection into your website or just doing something where you have gigantic vulnerabilities? And the problem is because you can't audit your code, all you're doing is prompting the AI, copy and pasting it over and over and over again until you finally get the right answer, whether you even know if it's working for scaling issues or building this up or whatever it may be. But then what happens if you're in a situation where you don't want to be an entrepreneur, you're learning how to code to get a job? How does that even help you in the long term?
There, that one video of like that some person in tech had their daughter build the full-blown app using kind of all the off-the-shelf AI tools, like probably like Bolt or something like that, and then the whole discourse around that is just going to lead thousands of people astray that would have learned to code, had wonderful careers, or now just like, I don't need it, I got the AI, I'm going to cook it up. And then when their rehashing of their directory app or their their to-do list doesn't work out anymore, you're gonna be in a tough spot. It's pretty wild.
It really doesn't make sense to me. Like it's the whole thought around it is just so foreign and weird.
Yeah.
And the fact that people aren't, and that's the problem too. Even as a beginner, it's hard for you to audit where you get your advice from, right? And so when you see this developer in this community telling you like, oh, you should do this, they're like, well, this is an established developer. Sure, I'm just going to take their advice and run with it. And so that, are we rolling?
I don't know. We just been talking. Hold on. Yeah, I think we're rolling. Uh-oh. Editor, please.
Oh, man.
Because we stopped and then we started again.
Oh, God.
Uh-oh. I'm glad we don't stream this.
Let me. I guess. You know what? Let's run with this one.
Let's do it.
Let me explain the context.
Yep.
Well, let's. I guess start with the intro at this point. Hey, everybody, what's going on? We got another episode. I guess this is gonna be the topic of our episode today. All right, I am Danny Thompson. I'm the director of technology at a company called This.Labs.
And I'm Leon Noel, Manager Director of Engineering at Resilient Coders and a wonderful community member at a wonderful community called 100 Devs.
So I guess let me provide the context. Yeah, so I keep finding myself in this discussion over and over again. And so the discussion and the overall context is I'm seeing advice that goes around saying when it comes to learning how to code and like going in the future or even now, the idea shouldn't necessarily be revolving around learning further syntax or learning the programming logic that goes with it. It should be more so along the lines of being able to explain your problem in English to an AI and having them develop it for you. And so I see how this could be like a great viral tweet or headline or YouTube video. But if we're being completely honest, it's really bad advice because to me, at least now, there's no telling how it's going to progress in the future, right? We all have our ideas and thoughts. But I remember like 3 years ago, Twitter was going insane. Developers are getting replaced. I remember seeing one video, and I'm guessing they deleted it, but it was like this Indian YouTube channel, but they were on Instagram and they're promoting that AI is going to replace all developers by 2023. And then they're like, if you want to stay ahead of the curve, you got to do this. And then I saw another video where it was like 2024. And so I went back looking for them because I wanted to download those videos to make a video on it, and they're gone. I can't find it anywhere. And so I'm like, obviously that wasn't the case. Those predictions were terribly off. But I don't think we're anywhere remotely close to where a developer can develop anything without being active in the process with that AI, right? And so when you tell people you don't need to know programming logic, I was like, if anything, AI's basically trained on code that it finds in repos, right? Some of it may be good code, some of it may be bad code. You mix it all together, you get pretty average code. Or oftentimes what I get from responses is pretty mediocre code at best, right? Like below average, nothing great. It barely passes the bar. It may solve that problem, and then I come in there tweaking it further to make sure it's like working for all the use cases that I have. Unless I'm just going very minute into it and like, I need this use state to work like this. I need this, which is at that point, I could write that stuff myself, right? I'm just using it to speed up that process. And so for me, if anything, I feel like you need deeper understanding of programming logic now more than ever, because how are you improving that code? How are you optimizing it? And how are you making sure that it's even helping you when it comes to the idea of like scaling, right? Everything works when you have 2 customers. But what happens when you have 100 customers, 1,000 customers, 10,000? The things that you have to start thinking about that point isn't how you make a use effect, but more so along the lines of how does this architecture work? And am I going to do a monolithic repo kind of approach to this? Am I going to go with microservices? Am I going to go with cloud service architect? Like, what am I doing? The problems become larger that you need to think about. And then as you think of the larger problem and you start breaking it down, that's where all that logic comes in. And just knowing how to prompt AI is not going to be the solution for you at that point.
Yeah, I think people kind of get lost in the idea of how people actually learn, or lost in the idea of how you could take someone from zero to being effective as a developer, right? So if you're already a developer, some of these tools can seem like magic. Wait a minute, I can type in this set of words and I get code that's like somewhat reasonable. And you see that, and then you turn to someone who has zero experience. And you say, hey, just type in these words, you'll get this code. They don't know if that code works, if it is performant, if it is secure. They don't know, right? And so that's the first issue. But then the second issue is, all right, to get those magic words that you type into any of these AI services, often I think people just forget about all the effort it took them to understand how to break down these large goals into small individual topics, to break down these large goals into the things that they actually wanted to build, and understanding the architecture underneath of it so that they could prompt in the right way. And all of that is lost if you just jump straight to the plain English prompting that we're kind of seeing be like a meme online. And so, yes, can you spin up simple apps with some interesting prompts? I've been playing with Replit agents for like the past 2 weeks. It's fun. It seems like magic. But if you're talking about going from zero to being an effective engineer, we're so far away from you being able to just use this prompting to be a weapon on most engineering teams. And you do yourself a disservice of leaning into that right away. We might be years away from where that's going to be an actual, like what you're doing day to day process as an engineer. And you want to be building up those foundations so you come up with even better prompts, right? Like if you want to believe in this hype of prompt engineering in the future, great. Software engineering, coding, yes, there's syntax involved there, but it's a way of thinking. It's a way of organizing your thoughts. It's a way of approaching problems. And you do yourself a disservice if you've never gone through those exercises to build up in your brain how you build these things, how you think about problems, how you develop the logic. And if we're just taking an English major and dropping them in front of Bolt, then it's going to not produce the results that we want long term. And so I think if you're someone that's like listening and you're hearing this advice, it's bad advice because it's stopping your development now, but it's also depriving you of the skills that you're going to need for the next 3, 5, 10 years of your career. And so I think we need to take some time to put people on a better path. Especially January's popping up. We always have so many folks that are like, hey, I want to learn how to code. Probably the most common question I know as soon as December hits, all I see in my inbox is, hey, your course, can I do this? Can I learn? And so I think there's a lot of really dangerous information out there right now that's going to stop a lot of people from being successful when they could have been successful. They could have gotten a job. They could have learned this stuff. And if they're going to believe this hype magic, it's just going to put people on the wrong path. You know? So
Yeah, you know what's funny is you kind of said one thing that reminded me of this, and I just looked it up as you were talking. So if you saw me look off, I apologize. It's not that I'm ignoring you. I wanted to find something that supports kind of what you're saying. But if you remember, and this is the whole problem with social media as a whole, and so everyone thinks they're a genius on something, and it's always the reason why my advice has always been when it comes to stuff on social media, hell, podcasts, YouTube videos, whatever it may be, let whatever someone says spark an idea and then do some research. Don't just take whatever you see to run with it. Because do you remember one thing that came out earlier this year that tech Twitter ran with? And that was Devin AI from Cognition Labs.
yeah,
It's going to replace all developers. I just decided to look real fast at like the latest to see when people were talking about it. And I see like 2 tweets in November, 1 in September, and then before that, nothing before May. It's like it came in because it's a great headline, right? And then as people started messing with it, like, all right, it's a great AI tool. I don't see it replacing all software developers. And it just kind of fell off after that, right? I'm not going to say that the company fell off or anything like that. I don't know anything about that. But I can tell you right now from what I'm seeing on the search, I don't see anything that anyone's saying it's totally replacing them. Like it can definitely do tasks, but that task is still going to be motivated by you prompting it in some way, shape, or form. And then when it does that task, it's not even doing it at the highest level. And then I remember I saw one comment here where it's like, when it comes to edge casing or testing or optimizing, you can also prompt those things. But the problem is, can you, with number one, if you don't have deep programming logic, do you even know if it needs to be optimized? Do you even know if it's exposing a certain edge case or test case? The only way you're going to know that is by having that logic or knowledge beforehand in order to see that and be like, this is actually exposing SQL injections here. We need to go ahead. We need to fix that. Or this right here is actually excluding this entire service that we're using here. We need to go ahead and prompt it for that. If you don't have that knowledge going in, you won't be able to do that.
Yeah.
But I think, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think like the other thing too that I think like, yes, you're missing the knowledge. And the other thing too, I just think about that just gets me kind of very upset late at night is that Devin destroyed the lives of people. Like it did. Like there are so many people that probably would have went into engineering, that would have went on this learning to code path, that saw this hype and are like, you know what? That's probably not a safe career for me. I don't want to do it. I don't want to learn. And they use it as an excuse. This AI stuff is the biggest excuse you could have ever given folks that were kind of just on the edge, just on the crest of like putting the time and energy to learn this stuff and unlocking a wonderful career versus not. And so if those folks had just for the past 6 months been grinding away learning this code, they would have been getting jobs. No, not getting jobs by now, but like they would have been on a good path to a good, wonderful career. And so if you're listening to this and you're letting this AI stuff be the excuse, like I get it. All right, it's the best excuse that's ever been created. But like, what are you doing otherwise? Like, are you going into the plumbing apprenticeship? Like, what are you doing? Like, don't let the next 6 months pass the same way. You're much better off having learned the code for 6 months and then being an even better prompt engineer than you would have been if you just used that excuse and stop. And so when I think of that, I'm just like, wow, I had 5 people get jobs yesterday. On our Discord call, we had 5 people get jobs. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, what if you had listened to this like hype just a few months ago and stopped? You would not be gainfully employed with the salaries that you have if you had listened to that. And so I think one thing you brought up too that I always like is like, don't listen to random people on the internet, right? Like, don't listen to me, right? Like, don't like, if you find something that I said, like, look it up, research it, go into it, but you're letting your life be swayed by Twitter conversations, and that's so silly. Like, stop. Like, what is the alternative? Take action, learn, and maybe we can talk a little bit about like what they should be doing that will help them get there. But this is the best excuse that's ever been made. But there have been excuses this entire time, right? We've talked about this in past a little bit, but like when I was first coming up, offshoring was going to be the big thing, right? Then nearshoring, and then the most common thing to what we're seeing now was the no code. No code can build apps. Right now, I can click a few buttons and I can build any major SaaS app that you want with no code. How many of the major SaaS apps are built using no code right now? It's possible. You can do it. Why? Right? Like, why are there not major apps that are using these things? And it's because, well, the same things we're starting to see with the AI. There's more underneath the hood than just that surface level understanding. There's more underneath the hood that you need to be able to tweak and optimize and own. And if you're just using the regurgitations of the AI, you're in a bad spot. So please don't delay. Start today. Don't let this be your excuse because you're stopping yourself from a beautiful career.
I'll say one more thing to this. I work in now, the first time ever, I work at This Dot Labs. It's a tech consultancy. We work with some very large partners, like very large organizations. A lot of tech consultancies that I see out there, they use extremely high hourly rates, right? Like I've seen consultants charging $400 per hour, $300 per hour. If an AI tool existed where they could be like, yeah, we'll do your work $400 an hour, and they could produce all this without needing a dev intervening at all. Can you imagine the amount of hourly rates that they could be charging these people and keeping their overhead significantly lower? There's definitely tools to help, but it's nowhere close. Because otherwise, and me being in a company like this, we'd be making money hand over fist without having to bring people in there or get involved in order to do it. It's just not there.
And the other thing too is like, they don't care, right? Like the clients I've worked with, like, I mean, I've done lots of freelancing. Freelancing has been a bulk of my career. No, like until I've gotten to larger scale applications where they've already had teams, no one is like, Leon, why'd you make that technical decision there to like include Flim Flam Corp? Like they're running their business, right? They don't care about those decisions that are kind of like that are the muck, right? Get me the result, right? And so if you're talking about kind of working with other individuals, the long tail of that is the sauce has to get made somehow. Whether you're incorporating AI tools, whether you're building your own, it's still about delivering results. It's still about kind of getting to that end goal. And so if you're learning right now, you can learn all those things to get to the end goal. And yeah, you may incorporate AI. Wonderful. It's not there yet to kind of do these larger full scale pieces. And even if it was, wonderful. The people that you're working with don't care. Incorporate it, learn it, include it. Like, I don't think that should be that's not the kind of the rub here, but you'll find that there's always been like a boogeyman, and we got to be mindful of like, is that stopping us from delivering value? Is that stopping us from getting the things that we want done? And the moment that it can, it won't change anything. The moment Devin could build those full scale apps, they still don't want to click the buttons. How many clients have we worked with that were restaurants? How many clients have we worked with that were weed shops that could have easily gone on Squarespace, could have easily gone Webflow and clicked a few buttons, but they don't, right? Like, because they have other priorities, and your job as an engineer is to solve problems. The tools don't matter. And if AI was to take over, it'd still be the same thing. What? I don't know how to type that into GPT. How do I type that into Bolt? Like, all right, then that's the new skill that you learn that takes you there. And that extends your runway even longer as this being a career. So I see it as like, it's not going to take over in the next 2 to 3 years, right? If it was perfect, it would still take companies 2 to 3 years to start implementing those systems, to start understanding like, the security around it, the like all that stuff. Like I'm saying, like pie in the sky, we hit like deep acceleration, like great. Still is going to be that ramp up period. And then even when we get to that point, you still have 2 more years of like the normie type companies that don't know how to use these tools, still don't know how to like connect their domain name. So if you're freelancing, you're still bringing in that cash. So you're talking about, to me, even in like the best case scenario, AI is replacing developers left and right. It's still like 5 years, like for it to be implemented, to be like utilized, to be like it. So what are you going to do over these next 5 years? Are you just going to sit there and like let hundreds of thousands of dollars slip between your fingers, or are you going to take action? Stop looking for an excuse. There's always been an excuse. Take action.
So I guess since we're on this topic, it just kind of makes sense as a segue. Like, how do you see learning to code in 2025 looking, right? Like, we're in a different market than we've been in for many years. The introduction of AI has probably intimidated quite a few people. Or even taken it, like, I guess one extra step further, if you've already been learning how to code and maybe you stopped, right? Everything intimidated you and now you're trying to finally get back into it. What I guess advice do you have in for there? Let's take the rest of this episode to do that for now.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think my learning advice is, well, I guess can I just give people a background? I've been teaching people to code for 10 plus years. I taught at Harvard. I've taught at MIT. I'm distinguished faculty at General Assembly. I've been running 2 nonprofits for the past years that have helped folks learn how to code. And so this is what I do. And what I've learned over the years of being in the classroom is that when it comes to learning and learning how to code, there are things that pop up that stop people from being successful, and it has nothing to do with code. So when I think about learning how to code, I think about, all right, how do you set the playing field so that you can then learn? And then we can talk about like the languages, the technologies, and all those pieces, the bits and bobs, right? So for me, if you're kind of embarking on hey, I want to learn to code in 2025, my first question always would be, why? Like, why do you want to do this? And it doesn't have to be like a wild kind of coming to moment of like realization. It could just be like, no, like, I'm hungry. I want to put food on the table. Great. That's a wonderful why. I have an interest in a better career. Good. The deeper you can build out your why over time, wonderful. But like, why are you doing these things? Great. What are you willing to do to achieve that thing? And that's a real conversation you have to have with yourself. I tell most of my students, go on a walk. Walk for an hour, 2, no headphones in, no anything. Like, what do you want out of your life? Why are you going to embark on this journey? Because it's tough. When we talk about learning, there's something called the trough of sorrow. You have this big hill that you're sitting on top of, full of excitement, full of energy. I call this Udemy hill because you buy all the Udemy courses that you never finish, right? And so you're on top of this hill, you're so excited, and then you start actually learning and you crash into the trough of sorrow. Then you have years of going through that trough of sorrow before you start to see like the wiggles of false hope and you actually get to where you want to go. So you have to have that why deep within you to actually make it through that trough. But the beautiful thing is, if you're going into this for a career, it's one of the happiest rated careers of all time. It's something that you can learn for free. You don't need a degree, and you can walk away with a 6-figure career. Like, that opportunity is something that doesn't exist in many other places that you could seize and start incorporating. So strong why, then it's your community. It's getting people bought into the journey you're going to go on. It's telling your significant other, hey, I'm going to need an hour or 2 every night to work on these things. It's getting your mama bought into, hey, I might be late for dinner on these days, right? Like, it's building that support system so people know that you're going to go on this journey. They're bought into it and they can actually like not detract from you going through it. Then there's kind of 2 more key pieces. One, it's setting up your day so you're not going into them like an accident. Like, what's your schedule? How can you be consistent? And then the last piece is like the learning strategies that you're going to utilize so that all the things that you're learning, you're not forgetting. So I bring up things like active recall, spaced repetition. Once you've laid the foundation, we can talk about all those pieces, then you can decide, all right, how am I actually going to learn these things? And there are so many resources online, completely free, wonderful ways to get started. Start with one of the free resources. Of course, I always recommend Free Code Camp, Odin Project, of course, 100 Devs. I'm a little biased there. Places that get started. But find what feels good to you, Pick that, get started, and commit to completing whatever course you decide to start with. If you start with a smaller course, see it to the end. Don't leapfrog. So many people jump from thing to thing to thing to thing, and they don't get to where they need to go. Stay the course on one thing, get to the end and reevaluate. So that's what I call like setting the field. I don't know if you have any other pieces for like how you set the field, get that mindset right. And then we can maybe talk about like the practical learning, what you're going to be doing, type stuff.
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts. As you were talking, I took a couple notes. There's some things that I agree with. Some things I actually have slight disagreement with. And so maybe this is like a healthy way to kind of talk about this. Number one, I definitely agree on the why. I think you have to have a why, but I also think you have to ask yourself a question, because I've had this conversation more times than I can count, thousands of times at this point, where someone is like, hey, you know what, man, if I don't get a job in 3 months, I'm quitting this learning the code thing. And it's like, hey, I totally get it. My question to you is, what are you doing after that? Because if you're just going back to the same circumstances that you were in, what changes? Or someone's like, Danny, I just started learning how to HTML, CSS. I need a job in 3 months. It's like, well, why do you need that job in 3 months? Because number one, that's a crazy timeline and amount of pressure to put upon yourself. And then, of course, because my mind was also like this at one point, it's like, well, I'm built different. I know I could do it. It's like, stop, you know, like there's only so far you can take it. But if you don't get that job in 3 months, like you just started learning how to code. So if you don't get that job in 3 months, what would have changed if you didn't pick up learning how to code then? Because obviously, if you're willing to put this timeline upon yourself in order to change your circumstances, what were you doing before you picked up a code editor and wrote your first div? Because obviously, to put that much constraint on yourself, it just means there was something already planned, right? So why did you abandon that plan? Is it because of a viral tweet, or because you know that there's a path here? If I follow it to the T, I'm going to land it in 3 months. That's a crazy timeline. I tell people all the time, I've only actually met one person in real life that has landed a job in 90 days from the time that they learned how to code to the time of employment. One person in real life. For the vast majority, it takes longer. And when I say longer, I mean, I put out a yearly survey every year, right? Now, it's not like Stack Overflow official. It's a Twitter poll. It's a LinkedIn poll. Hey, if you work in tech, only be the ones to reply. How long did it take you from learning how to code to landing your job? How long did it take? First option is 3 months. The second option is 9 months. Third option is 10 months to 2 years. And then the fourth option is 4 years plus. Only in the last poll, out of mixing the results from Twitter and LinkedIn, it was like 14,000 plus respondents, right? Only 6.2% of people landed a job in 3 months. That means almost 94% of the time, it took them 9 months or longer to land a job, with 60+% of the votes being over 4 years.
This is the pain boot camps have caused our industry, and how they've warped the minds of the masses into thinking that that's a reasonable path, when what they didn't realize is that they were talking about folks that already had PhDs, that have already been successful in their academic pursuits, that were then coming into an accelerated program that can then kind of get those types of results. Most folks haven't been in a learning environment in years. And so you have to realize it's like going into the gym. You don't go into the gym and start squatting 500 pounds right out the gate. Yeah, maybe there's some freaks of nature that are on the farm and they've been lifting every day since they were little, right? That could do it. But most people aren't going to come off the block and be able to do it. And so you can't compare yourselves to the freaks of nature. It's like, all right, you're going to walk into this environment. You have to put reasonable expectations on yourself, because it's also just like, forget everything, but it's just like being kind to yourself. You can't put that type of pressure on you. And then no wonder you're going to want to give up after the 3 months, because you were looking at the 3% of folks and you were sold that dream. And you have to realize that like, that's just not the normal case, even if there are a few freaks. And so if you haven't learned in a while, right? If you haven't flexed those muscles, how do you build them up? Right? Like, how do you give yourself that grace? And running into a course and saying you're going to drop 10 hours a day in it? Nah. Hundreds, thousands of people I've seen tell me that, they all disappear. right? You got to have these reasonable expectations, not only of like outcomes, but like the time you can invest and how you build up those systems so that you can be successful.
But Leon, I'm built different.
Yeah. So was Bob that never made it. Yeah. So was the I can know what would be really funny. I know it wouldn't be really funny. It's kind of mean. Would be to like just like take those messages and then like show that they're no longer on like the job. Like they're just not. They just go away. I can't tell you how many people come in arrogant to these like the programs I run that they just have that belief, and that's great. Like if you can be that person and like you got that dog in you, wonderful. Most people don't, because there's no amount of dog in you that's gonna make you walk into the gym for the first time and be in the 1,000 club, right? There's not. There's maybe less than 1% of people in this world that could do that because they've been working on the farm the whole time and they just didn't realize what they've been doing is lifting that whole time. And so academic pursuits are the same thing. If you haven't learned or haven't been in a learning environment for years, you can't walk into that gym and then put up numbers. It's just not going to work. And so you have to realize that, yeah, maybe you are built different, but this is an actual exercise that you have to commit to improving upon. And you might not walk in with that skill set, and you can't thug it out because it's too hard. It's too long. It's too much of a journey to commit to your brain. Your brain can only hold so much information at one time. And there's only so many things you can do to make especially if you're an adult learner, like actually retain information. And so it's just like a physical limitation, no matter how much chutzpah you have to kind of push forward, you know?
Yeah. So I'll say, going back to what I was saying earlier, there is one point that you said that I wrote down because I don't necessarily think the way that you said it is the way. And so you said that people have to buy in basically your community, like your mom, your friends, your family. For me, I actually had the closest people to me telling me to quit. The My wife couldn't see it. My mother definitely couldn't see it. To be honest, none of them even saw any. Even after I broke into tech, they didn't see it as success until I finally got to Google. And so to them, it was all just make believe. They did not see it. I remember my wife specifically because at that time in my life, I was working over 100 hours a week at the gas stations, right? Like that was the only way I could provide. And then all of a sudden we're starting to lose income because I got to take off for this interview, or I got to go whatever little remainder time I had left, because at that time in my life, literally I was making just enough money to be poor as hell and barely pay the bills. And we were struggling so hard. And I was working at all these different places going back and forth, but it was just barely enough for us. And I remember, especially with the newborn, man, that was killing us. But I remember when I started seeing that drop in income and I'm like, hey, we need to start cutting this out of our thing right here. Or I remember like when we were switching car insurance, for example, right? I was like, we got to go to cheaper insurance. Like, there's no way I could afford this. We got to find another company. And she's like, we're giving this up because you're not getting enough hours here. And then I'm pulling all these extra hours here. Why are we doing this? It's hard for them to see what you see. And I've said this forever. I was like, I no longer believe that I need people to see the vision. I just need to bring it to life so then they can buy into what I bring to life. And so for me, specifically, I don't think you need your loved ones to fall into it. You just need to tell them, this is the lifestyle change that I'm making. So even if coding is not the thing that works out, that's fine. But if you're in the pursuit of doing something better, they're going to be on board. So it's like, you know what? Coding didn't work out for me. But you know what I realized? I'm not going to go back to the gas station or to the warehouse. It's time for me to pick up a trade. I finally got back into education. I realized this is the thing for me. Maybe it's time for me to do medical coding. Maybe it's time for me to be an HVAC person. Whatever it may be. Maybe this is not the thing for you, but it's the thing that led you on the path of saying, you know, it's time for me to do something better. I don't like technology. It wasn't what I thought it was cracked up to be. Maybe it's another field. Or maybe you're like, you know what? I don't really like this coding thing. I want to be a product manager though. I feel like this was the path for me. Or, you know, I didn't like JavaScript, but you know, I really loved touching AWS, and cloud is the path I want to go down. Boom. That's the path that you end up going down. Or, you know, you're like, you know what? I really hate this stuff, but you know what I really, really like the most? I ended up learning a lot about HR in this process. And I started realizing how HR interacts with tech teams. And I could totally be a great technical recruiter. Boom, maybe that's the path for you. Whatever it may be, don't let whatever you start with be like, it must be defined at that moment as being exactly what I'm going to do. I always say informed decisions are always led with first level of educated processes regarding that informed decision. So when it comes to learning how to code, what has been my advice this entire time, it's never changed. Start on freecodecamp.org, because in 90 seconds, you're writing your first line of code. And the reason why is I truly believe motivation and inspiration have expiration dates. They're going to expire, and you need to replace it with something, and you need to act on it right away. And so you make your first div. And that's why I always say front end is great for beginners, especially if you don't come from a programming background, because making a background red is exciting. Moving a div that you see on your page is exciting, and making it responsive is exciting. And so it gets you addicted earlier on. And then from there, you can kind of go with that process and start expanding upon it, right? But when you start just immediately starting with here's backend, and I can tell you this from firsthand experience from teaching at a bootcamp, they started with Python. And then from Python, they went to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then from that, they went to Java, right? And I remember it was a 3-module process, and the drop off from module 1 to module 2 was 70%.
Yeah.
And I remember having one student in particular, and like I'm trying to explain to him because it's not in the curriculum, right? But I remember having one student, he finished everything, even finished the final project required for module 1. And then he messaged me, Danny, I'm quitting. And I'm like, why are you doing it? You finished the work. You got the passing grade. He's like, yeah, but this is not what I wanted to do. I don't even understand how to make websites with this. And it's like, because they left this crap out. No one knew how it correlated to the process. Like it didn't make sense to them. And I remember being at another boot camp, and I was with someone who I believe is one of the goats to me, James Q. Quick. And as we're teaching, we're about halfway through, we've gone through HTML, CSS, JavaScript, we've gone through all that, and we're having like the group meeting before you break off into individual classes, and James is like the head lecturer. And I said, James, I know we're following the curriculum that has been provided to us, right? We have our opinions, but can I just ask one question to everybody in here? He said, sure, go for it. And so it's all remote. And so I jump on the Zoom call, and I said, hey, y'all, I got a question for you. You've been doing this for about 4 months. Show of hands, does anyone know how we use this HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that we've learned in the field or in a company? And 0 hands went up. And I'm like, this is why you can't just shout out syntax and not explain how it's being used. And even James was like, we need to fix this process. And we recorded that and sent it to the boot camp so that way they could see. It's like, this is where the knowledge gaps are. Like they have 0 clue how to apply any of this knowledge anywhere. And so for me, especially in 2025, if you're learning how to code and you're not doing it in some way, shape, or form, and the idea of like building something, you're doing yourself a disservice. Because for me, when I started learning how to code, I didn't start with the idea of getting a job. I didn't think that was possible at that time, but it was really more so like, I want to build something. So how do I go about building it? And because you're thinking of, okay, I need to build this button on this website. How do I go about doing that? Because you start diving down those rabbit holes for it, you start learning a lot, but you see how it's applied to a website that you're going to show it to people, right? But now you got to start thinking of a step further. It's like, I built this button, and it says sign up to this website. And so they fill out this form and they sign up. Where does that information go? That's when you start really diving deep into what's happening, and that logic starts building up more.
You said so many things. It's like, I sometimes just like, screw the podcast. Like, let's just like talk, like we got to edit. We got to get, I guess I can't.
Hopefully this is a good episode.
I don't know. But like, no, I still like so many cool things. Like so many things you're brought up that I just want to kind of like talk a second about too. Right. I think when it comes to learning, there's like this idea of like privilege in a way. Like everyone comes to this learning journey with different privileges. And so one of the things you have to really be mindful of, like, you can't look at the person to your left or your right because you don't know what they're coming to the table with. And so you brought up this idea of like, maybe family's not bought in to your like journey, right? And so when you're trying to get family on board, not everyone has that privilege of like people understanding like what they're about to do. And we had this question yesterday on Discord where they said, my family, like something along the lines of, my family can't understand like the work I'm putting in, and they don't they can't get behind me basically. And what we kind of broke down is this concept of like, well, Do they have a reason to trust that you're going to do what you're going to do? Have they ever seen you like put these ideas and then chase after something and achieve it? And if not, it's going to be a while for them before they come on board and see it. And so, like you're saying, you just have to go out there and do it, and then prove to them that like you can do the things that you're going to say you're doing, and build up that goodwill, build up that trust, give them that proof so they can see it. And so when you're coming to this learning journey, you have to realize like, what are your strengths? What are the things that you might not have, and not let that be an excuse or a thing that holds you back necessarily, but understanding that everyone comes to this journey with like a different level of privilege, but also different level of kind of just what's going to be easier or harder for them on their journey. And so I think when you're listening to people that are giving you advice, you have to be able to center that advice on like, that's not matching my real world scenario. How can I find individuals that understand where I'm coming from, can understand my challenges, and like I can be in community with them to like get over those blockers. And so I thought that was amazing. One of the things you also brought up is like the drop off between modules. And this is something everyone has to know. I love CS50. I think it's one of the best intro courses, best courses period ever created. They publish their numbers. And if you look at the in-class completion rate, it's like 99.7%. But if you look at their online completion rate, it's like 1%. And it's wild. So the number of people that come to this journey, right, that want to do it, that take that first step, but don't complete it is very, very, very damn high. And so like, what are you doing? What are you putting in place so you don't become one of the 98, 99% of folks that don't complete? All right. And so I think there are a lot of things you have to do. And you mentioned this idea of like motivation, kind of that goes away very quickly. Discipline is one of those things that can even wax and wane as well. And so like, what are the things you're putting in place so that you can go that distance and that journey, which I think is important to talk about. And then also like understanding that drop off, even in between chapters, is something that happens. At CS50, they noticed that at chapter end, they have a whole research paper on this. Like when you have a chapter end, you're more likely to be like, oh, I completed that chapter, I'm not going to go on to the next one. So you have to be like learning, like putting these strategies into place to like, how do I continue? How do I keep a consistent schedule? How do I like make these things so that I persist? But just being aware of it at first, I think is like a good first step. And then this last piece, which I think is the most important. All of this is silly if you're not building anything, right? If you learn HTML, your next step should be to build something with HTML. If you learn CSS, your next step should be build something with CSS. And it shouldn't be what they tell you to build either. If they tell you to build this like landing page, then you should go and make 3 more of different things that are valuable to you, that are meaningful to you, that fix the coffee shop down the streets. Like take it and make it your own. All these skills have to transfer into you building fingers on the keyboard. And if you're not doing that, if you're just kind of like absorbing it, like it's a normal YouTube video and you're like, yeah, like this tutorial is great. Like I'm learning so much. You're not. Learning comes from doing the things that are cognitively difficult, the things that you probably don't want to do. That's where the real things actually happen. And so you have to kind of take ownership and move forward and push and build. And that's where you're going to learn all these things. So I think you were spitting there for a bit.
Yeah. You know, 2 things I'll say. You said one thing about like in regards to like that person not supporting their family not supporting that person. This is part of the reason why, and I said this to a top executive at well, a bunch of them, because I said it at the lunch that we do for CEOs and CTOs. And I said, I'm now no longer a believer in buy into my vision, but I'm a believer in I have confidence by evidence. You don't need to believe my opinions anymore. Let me show you the evidence. And so for me, when it comes to like your family buying in, it's hard for them to realize how much work goes into, oh, I built this website. And it reminded me of one example. I remember when I was learning how to code, I built a website and my whole focus was, I want to learn how to make an API and send the API to the front end. That was my whole focus. How do I actually build? Because I kept hearing the term REST API, REST API. How do I make my own API? I don't have a clue. And here I am like learning Java. And I was like, I know how to like construct something, but how do I actually send it to the front end and showcase it? That was my whole focus. And so I went through all this, and it took me like a whole weekend of building this project of here's my back end, here's my front end, and I actually have them communicating, and here it is displaying it. Was it the most beautiful thing in the world? No, because my goal was really all the logic on the back end and how I mutate this and how do I change this. Oh, there was a new prompt that was sent in or a new field that was added. How do I actually add it to my API and then send it back to the front end to display? Like that was my whole focus. And so I remember showing it to my wife and she's like, oh, this doesn't really look good. I was like, oh, I mean, that wasn't the focus. But can you blame them? Because they're like, I'm a user and I go to these websites and I'm trying to help you because you're bought into this whole web development thing. I don't fault them at all because from their perspective, they don't understand the complexity of the back end and the front end and like how this is communicating. But to me, I'm geeking out because I finally did it. And do you know where I went and someone actually was like, this is impressive? A meetup.
Yeah.
I went to a meetup and they're like, oh man, this is great. I totally understand. I remember how it was when I made my first API. I know you went through it all. And they're looking at the code meeting, they're getting excited. Like, I know this took you more than a couple hours. Like, yeah, it took me the whole week. They're geeking out with you.
Yeah.
You can't get that from non-technical individuals. Sure, they may champion like, oh, great job, honey, you did this. But they really don't appreciate what went into it. Same way, like when you finally go to the gym and you see somebody benching 315, if you're someone who's worked out before, you really take appreciation into that as compared to somebody that just sees, oh, you got 3 plates on each side. That's cool. And even for me, it's like kind of what I said earlier. If you are learning a technology and you realize that's not the technology for you, that's cool. You know, for me, for a while, I was really struggling with losing weight, right? And I kept going to the gym. I'd get bored. It didn't really work out. And then I was like, you know what? I want to learn something, right? I want to do something that's healthy. I just want to learn something. And so I ended up doing Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu. And there I ended up losing over 100 pounds, right? It's like, I didn't join Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu as like, this is going to be my key to losing weight. It's like, I got to do something active. I got to do something that takes my mind off of just weights going up and down. And it was Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu. And that led me onto this entire path of being healthier, eating right, I still have a long way to go. But compared to where I was, I feel so great. I'm no longer wearing 6X t-shirts anymore, right? I'm in the 2s. That's a big difference. And so for me, that became the thing. So it doesn't matter if the thing that you're doing is not the thing that ends up becoming the thing that you are going to do. And so for me, I believe, especially as parents and stuff like that, it's hard to find time. So I don't think you need to be like, hey, I'm going to take an hour a day to learn how to code. It's like, I'm going to take an hour a day to dedicate to myself. Like I'm always doing all these other things for other people. Like I make everyone else a priority in my life. Let me be a priority for once. And so if you finally get down to the pass where you're like, you know what? Coding's not for me. That's completely okay. Or you're like, I love this coding thing and I'm digging it deeper. That's okay too. But at least you know every single day I'm dedicating 4% or 5% of my day. It's definitely less than 5%, 4%, 3% of my day to myself. And whether it's coding, whether it's HVAC, whether it's UI UX, whether it's becoming a Scrum Master, whether it's getting your product management certification, whatever it may be, you're dedicating that time. So that way your family starts getting into the momentum of it's 5 o'clock, from 5 to 6. That's when Danny dedicates that hour. So let's start doing something at 6:30. They're going to give you that time for that hour a day. And so as it compounds over time and you start getting a lot of evidence to support all the stuff that you've been doing, you turn a non-believer into a believer. You turn a viewer into a fan, and you end up turning someone who doubted your abilities into the greatest cheerleader you could have.
Let's go.
Yeah, you know what? I think we're gonna have to do like a part 2 to this, maybe.
Yeah.
We'll do this. If y'all like this, number one, please drop a like on whatever platform you're listening to this, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple, whatever it may be. Please like the show, whatever, if you're enjoying this. But let us know in the comments. Do you want a part 2 to this? Maybe we should do a whole thing where it's like, all right, if I'm learning how to code in 2025, this is the exact way that I'm going to do it.
Well, so the thing is, we didn't even get to that. Like that was, I think that we were trying to go, but like the idea too, and I think this is the important bit though. I think this is the stuff that actually really matters. This is the shift that takes you from like a thought about it to like I'm actually taking action to do it. And like all these little things that we talked about are the things that actually matter. Like picking Java or JavaScript or Python, like that doesn't matter. And people hyper fixate on like, I have to do this thing. I have to do this tool. I have to do this thing. And it's like, bro, you didn't even like, you didn't even like figure out like how you're going to find the time to learn this stuff. You haven't figured out like how you're going to give yourself that 4%. You all these things that you have to like, that mindset shift has to come before it. And if you hyperfixate on these other things, it could just lead you down a really weird path. And so, yeah, I think part 2, we can definitely get more of the details, but I think that the mindset shift that has to happen for this to occur is equally important. So yeah, I think it'd be a lot of fun to kind of continue it.
Yeah, we didn't really come into this one with a full agenda, so maybe we should have like breaking down each section of what we talked about. But to be honest, we're kind of rolling without realizing it. So you let us know if you want a part 2. I know all those YouTube videos come out already, so I'm like, do we really need one? But if the community says they want one, we'll do it. We'll break down like, this is the exact, I guess, tool I would use or path I would take or technology, et cetera, and we can kind of deep dive into that. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. I feel like we've addressed a lot in this episode, and let's kind of do that. Do you want to do answering a question and wrap this episode up? All right, so we're gonna ask the question for Ask Danny and Leon, or Ask Leon and Danny a question for the podcast. So here's the question today.
So the question that we had come in today was, what are the to-dos for when you land your first development job? It seems like this person recently got their job. What are some of the things you're thinking through? And kind of what would that advice be to someone that kind of just got that first gig?
Yeah, I've got a whole process. I've even done long talks on this, so I'll just do a short version to answer this one. For me, I have a strategy when you land your very first job in tech, but to be honest, it's pretty much any job. The 4 things that you need to do within the first 6 months, right? And so obviously keeping it technical related, I'll tell you the 4 items and I'll expand upon it. It's code, process, team, value. Those are the 4 things you need to do in your first 6 months. So what does that mean? Code. You got to know the code base. There's no way around it. Now, nobody's saying that you need to memorize it line for line for line, but you need to know that code base. And so, and the reason why is in the beginning, when you're in team planning meetings, when you're sprint planning reviews, et cetera, when you're talking about ticket, you're in meetings for like refining tickets and backlog, you need to kind of understand what that code looks like. So if someone's saying, hey, we need to start improving this checkout process and we need to tweak this, to a certain degree, your mind should already be like, I know exactly how this checkout process works. I know what these components are. You don't necessarily need to know every single use effect in line, but you need to know where some of the logic is, right? And so the way you start figuring that out is a method that I call follow the rabbit hole. And so giving you an easy example, let's say on the front page of the website, there's a button that needs to be fixed, right? For a lot of juniors and even interns, they may go jump in and fix that button and they hand that ticket back. Nobody's going to be mad. But what if you held that ticket for an extra hour and you're like, so I'm fixing this button. When I press this button, what's happening? Start following that rabbit hole. What is it connected to? Maybe it's going through things that you never heard of before, middleware and services and a microservice. But through repetition of time, you start getting introduced to a lot more components, items, values. You start figuring things out. You start figuring out, maybe you're a front-end dev, but you start realizing, oh, on the back end, it's talking to this thing. Your logic and your impression of this entire code base starts growing. Like that hour compounds off of each ticket. So if you do 20 tickets, that means you got 20 extra hours that you've introduced yourself to other areas of the code base. You start getting a deeper understanding and logic of the code base. That helps out a lot of people. The second thing is process. You need to obviously, and I'm not talking necessarily processes of the code base, which you do need to do and to know, but processes within an organization. Like for me, my very first tech job was the first time I ever worked in offices, right? I had zero idea of what a sprint planning meeting was. I didn't know how to size the ticket. I didn't know what were some of the processes in regards to like how an organization will structure their team around it, right? So you need to learn those processes as quickly as possible. The third thing was team. What is your team dynamic? When, for example, for some teams, you're going to be having a dedicated person that you reach out to that is like your quote unquote mentor or your go-to individual, right? It's often not even going to be your manager. So you need to know who that individual is, but also who's your management? How does a scrum master have any relation to your team? How does a product manager get involved? How does a product owner relate to the things that you're doing? Who's your director? And how can I get a skip level meeting with him every 3 months, every quarter, every 6 months, or every, how, whatever that repetition is. What is a skip level meeting and how would that even go? These are things that you need to start figuring out so that way you get visibility onto the things that you're going into. Other thing is, for me, I'm a big believer, you must demand one-on-one meetings, and your one-on-one meetings shouldn't be, hey, I'm working on this ticket, let me tell you about it. No. Your one-on-one meeting is your dedicated time to add visibility to everything that you're getting involved with and doing. And for me, I use that as a way, like, I need growth within this company. How do I do that? What do I need to do? And so I use that as a tool. And so I'll have a document, a living document between me and my managers. And I'll say, hey, here, every single meeting, let's review everything that we worked on. Maybe there's an action item that came out of that one-on-one, right? So I'll make check boxes. And so at the beginning of every meeting, I'm like, let's review that stuff. Oh, there was a checkbox there. Manager, can you check that off for me? And so when they do that, guess what ends up happening? When it's 6-month review time or year review time, guess what? Unlike others that are scrounging through every single PR and MR that they've made, trying to figure out what they did, I've got this living document between me and my manager. I don't have much to fight for at that point because they know. And the last thing is value. You need to know your team's value to the organization. And so to give you an idea, I always end up pretty much working on e-commerce in one way, shape, or form within the team. So it's checkout team, e-commerce team, whatever it may be. And so for me, I'll go through the checkout process multiple times through the eyes of a user as a customer instead of the eyes of a developer. I want to know what that experience looks like, but I also want to know, how does the company look at it? Is it directly revenue numbers that they're looking at? Is it going through conversion rates, or is it going through capture rates? I want to know all that stuff. So when I start getting into conversations, I can talk about the value our team has, as well as how I'm implementing extra value to the team, to the overall organization. That's how you end up having really fruitful discussions. And if you're doing that within your first 6 months, you can't go wrong.
Love it. I think that so many pieces here are just like brilliant bits of advice. That living document is genius. That's something that I just see so many of my students kind of get themselves in hot water over, and having that document will really save a lot of things. Um, a lot of the folks that I've worked with that have moved into tech didn't work in tech before and may not have been in a normal like corporate environment. And so a lot of the advice I give is very similar to what you said. And then also kind of just thinking through like, all right, how do I get my folks comfortable? How do I get them communicating? And so I think two things I would tack on is very early on, like you said, you want to have that one-on-one with your manager, right? Like you want to figure out, what are my goals for the 3, 6, 12 months on this job? Like, what are the things that if I did, I would have been over the moon successful? You put that into some sort of document and you send it. Like it has to be a receipt somewhere, right? You put it in an email, you thank them for their time, you thank them for the meeting, and then the effort you put in those first 3 months, you can coast on for the first year or two. And so really trying to crush those objectives in that first 3 months, make sure you're kind of knocking off all the things that were on that list that you both agreed to, is kind of the first step. And then that kind of removes all the surprises that could happen at those reviews, because you've already agreed. There's already this document that you've shared now that you're agreeing to and working against. So there shouldn't be a surprise when you hit that review period that you've done or not done what you're supposed to. The other big thing I push people to do is to really build relationships with folks, because a lot of my students, they kind of just retreat to themselves. And I have this thing I push them to do, which is the never eat alone playbook, which is the idea of like literally never eat alone. Your lunches should be with a team member. First your team, then any external team, skip level, anything you could think of. Like you really should make that effort to have that level of communication with folks, because it's really hard to lay off folks that you like, or a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to if you're that entry level person, to get pulled off of a team and plop somewhere that's not great, like if you haven't been building those relationships. So really in those first couple of weeks or months, like honestly, don't eat alone. Like literally schedule time to go grab lunch to build those relationships is really important. And then the other piece that I would say is, if you're building the relationships, you're kind of moving against these kind of like metrics that you're supposed to be hitting. The other piece is that a lot of my folks, they don't ask enough questions in the beginning. They things that should have gotten done in an hour, they're taking a week on because they just didn't ask. And so I want them to get really comfortable asking lots of questions. And the normal thing that I tell them to go is like, go to your team and be like, hey, for the first month or two, can I ask every wild, silly question that's ever come to my brain, just because I'm new to the code base and I would like to not be blocked, and I would love to just be able to develop code. Is it okay for me to ask you these like really, I'm going to come to you with a question and you're like, that's the dumbest question I've ever heard. But I guarantee in that moment, I will make documentation around it. I will make sure that anybody else that ever joins this team will not ask that question. I'll never ask that question to you again, but just so that I can go as fast as possible. Is it okay? And most people that you work with will be totally fine with it. And then you take all this weight off your shoulders because they've agreed that you can ask all the silly questions, but you lead up to that promise. You document everything. You make sure that you never ask the same question twice. You make it so that the next person that joined doesn't have to ask those same questions. There's something that they can look at. And that enables you to pick up speed. It removes some of the fear, it removes some of the pressure. You know what you're shooting against because you've had that one-on-one with your manager, and you're building the relationships so that as you grow in the org, you can deliver that value, you can do all the things that are going to kind of help you stand out. Yeah.
Love that. Well, this is probably going to be one of our longest episodes, and people have been asking for longer episodes. So there you go. I don't think this is going to be the norm, but I feel like we've touched on so dang much that we probably needed to add some length. But yeah, if you want a part 2, let us know and we'll try and do it. Drop it in the comments. We kind of look at all the comments, or email us. Or if you want your question to be answered on the podcast, email us at Danny and Leon's podcast at gmail.com. Is that right? Let me look this up real fast. I believe that is
there's some Leon and Danny that's just pissed off.
Yeah. Yeah, it's Danny and Leon's podcast at gmail.com. And you'll also see that email address in the show notes. So if you want to email us, that's the place to do it. Outside of that, y'all, it's been real. It's been fun. I think we've touched on a lot. And so if you like this, let us know, and we'll see you on the next one. Goodbye, everybody.
Peace.